Hi everybody, welcome to Mini Mastermind. This is Mahira Gururani, and today we'll be learning about short-run equilibrium output. Recently, I made a video based on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Today I'm going to talk about a concept related to that, but it's different from that. There, we learned about equilibrium output, the output where AS equals 80. Today what we're going to do is that we're going to learn about this very equilibrium output. But this equilibrium output can only be measured in the short run. What is the short run? Short run is such a period of time where technology is bound to not change. So when technology is not going to change within a certain time period, that time period is called the short run. Because if technology will remain constant, then the only way we can affect output is by increasing or decreasing employment. So in short-run equilibrium output, we mainly see how employment affects output, not about how technology affects output. That's why what happens is that in short-run equilibrium output, we only take a short run or a period of time where all that can be influenced is technology itself. Now in the last video, we learned about AD and AS. AD equals aggregate demand or aggregate expenditure, as all the planned demand is somewhere in the future going to get converted into expenditure. And we also learned that aggregate supply equals national income, because all that is supplied will generate income for the various providers of the factors of production. So the people who provide factors of production or factor services are households, and households earn their money equal to the aggregate supply. So AS equals Y. So we have concluded that equilibrium is when aggregate demand equals aggregate supply, or AD equals AS, which means AD equals Y, or aggregate demand equals income. Now, what happens is that means that all the producers plan to produce is planned to be consumed by the consumers. So all output which is planned to be produced by the producers is planned to be consumed by the consumers, which means there will be no shortage or no surplus. So what will happen if AD is greater than AS? Okay. Now, if AD is greater than AS, that means there's excess demand, and that excess demand will keep on pressurizing the limited output. That will cause inflation, and the prices will increase. And what will happen is that for all the producers, there will be a shortage of output, because once all the demand that could be fulfilled is fulfilled, then there's certain demand left but no supply. So what will happen is that there's a shortage, and the producers will face loss because they weren't able to utilize all they needed to provide all for demand. Now what if AS is greater than AD? That means there's some leftover stock or unsold goods, which is also a loss for traders, as this is actually an undesired stock. So this undesired stock is kind of like a negative part of producers. Now what happens is that AD equals C plus I in a two-sector economy, since aggregate expenditure equals consumption plus investment expenditure in a two-sector closed economy. But Y, or AS, equals C plus S, consumption plus saving. So if consumption plus investment equals consumption plus saving, which that means that I equals S, or investment equals saving, at the state of equilibrium. That's why there's the SI approach of savings and investment approach of calculating equilibrium. Now there's some important concepts. Ex ante and ex post. Yes, I discussed this in my previous video, but let's just give it a quick revise. Ex ante savings and ex ante investment is a planned savings and planned investment, but ex post savings and ex post investment is the actual savings and the actual investment. So when we look at the equilibrium, we see the ex ante savings and investment, not the ex post. So right now what we're learning is actually Keynesian Theory of Economics. So Keynesian Theory of Economics has certain assumptions, and we'll go through them. But first, let's do a brief recap of AD and AS. AD is a planned expenditure of the households, right, on goods and services. So the planned expenditure done by the households on goods and services is called AD. Now, AD has two components in a two-sector closed economy: consumption expenditure and investment expenditure. Now, investment expenditure is considered autonomous. So what happens is that investment expenditure, when represented on a graph, is a straight horizontal line drawn at it's the same level of investment at all incomes. So it's a horizontal straight line representing the same amount of investment no matter what the income. However, that is not how it works in real life. And consumption is the other part of AD. Consumption actually is positively related to the income. So the more your income, the more your consumption. But what happens is that there's consumption even at zero level of income. This is autonomous consumption. Autonomous consumption is a necessary amount of consumption. So even when your income is zero, you will do autonomous consumption. Now what happens is that consumption, that's why it doesn't start at the origin. Because if it starts at the origin, that means it's zero when income is zero, but that is not the case. It starts somewhere on the y-axis after the origin, because what happens is that there is autonomous consumption, so it starts on the y-axis. Alright, so that was consumption expenditure. And it has a positive relationship with income. Now what happens is that then there's AD, which is the planned expenditure, or consumption plus investment. Now what happens is that consumption plus investment, well, investment is autonomous, it's the same everywhere, which means aggregate demand is parallel to consumption, because the difference between them is investment. So aggregate demand is parallel to consumption. Remember that and keep that in mind. Now coming to aggregate supply. Aggregate supply is a planned output, okay? It's represented by a 45-degree line from origin. And it's a 45-degree line because on one axis there's income, the other there is AD. On the other there is AS. So on one axis there's income, the other is AS, right? So that means on the x-axis there's income, on the other there's AS. So what happens is that since income is equal to AS at all levels, there is a 45-degree line. Now, the point of intersection between this 45-degree line and AD is known as the equilibrium. And the amount of output at the equilibrium is known as equilibrium output. Now, what happens is that the amount of demand and supply at that point is known as equilibrium AD and equilibrium AS. At that very same point, S equals I, or savings equals investment. Now, what happens is that according to Keynesian economics, Keynes was actually studying all this. He made this theory at the time of the Great Depression. So that time the economy was going through a depression, and there was excess capacity in the economy, which means that most of the resources were unutilized and lying around idly. So what Keynes proposed was that AS, or aggregate supply, is not affected by the price. AS is not affected by the price because the price remains constant. Because the price increases when... Sorry there was a certain message so my video got cut off. But anyways, price is affected only when there is an extra pressure, like there's an excess pressure on the limited resources present in the market. So that building pressure causes a price increase. But if there are already more resources, then that pressure can be coped up with more production. So what Keynes proposed was that during the time of depreciation, obviously there was excess capacity, so he proposed that AS is perfectly elastic. And that means that AS will always respond to a change in AD. Like whenever there's a change in aggregate demand, there's a proportionate change in AS accordingly, because AS is supposedly perfectly elastic. That's why whatever effect there will be on AD, increase or decrease, it may be, but there will be an equal proportionate increase in AS. Now, what happens if 80 is greater than AS or 80 is less than AS? Well, what happens is that look at if 80 is greater than AS. That means there's excess demand on the limited amount of supply. Now, if there's too much demand on the supply, first of all, what the producers will do is that they'll rush to their stock, the amount of inventory they've kept for such purposes. Now, if that inventory is going to be used for the excess demand in the market, then what will happen is that there's a fall in the planned inventory. The amount of inventory that is planned to be kept is actually less because now the company has withdrawn some inventory from the planned inventory. So when 80 is greater than AS, there's a fall in planned inventory. And what happens is that when 80 is less than AS, there will be a rise in unplanned inventory. Because what will happen is that since there's too much supply to have any demand, nobody's demanding that much as there's being supplied, there is some excess amount that's left over. And that is kept in the form of inventory, but that inventory is known as unplanned inventory or undesired inventory since it was not actually according to the company's plan and it was not desired by the producer. Now that was all about the AS80 approach. What about the SI approach, or the savings investment approach? Now, we all know about savings. Savings is positively related to income. So the more the income, the more the saving, right? Right, but saving can be negative. It's not negatively related to income, but it can be negative. For example, when income equals 0, there is some level of autonomous consumption, and at lower income levels, then also the consumption is greater than income. So at those moments, saving is negative. So although saving is positively related to income, with an increase in income, saving increases, with a decrease in income, saving decreases, but saving can be negative. So it starts from the negative y-axis. And autonomous investment, investment is always autonomous according to your syllabus. So even at 0 rupees, we'll spend the same amount as we'll spend in 100 rupees income. So be your income 0 or 100, we will be spending the same amount on investment expenditure according to our syllabus. Now, that was about investment expenditure and saving expenditure. Sorry, investment expenditure and savings. Now what happens is that just plot a graph in your mind. There's a y-axis positive and negative, and there's the x-axis in between. Now what happens is that there's a line starting from the y-axis a little bit above the x-axis, so it's starting a little bit high, and then there's a straight line. Now it's not necessarily a little bit high. Here I'm taking the example of investment being 20. Now, for example, if investment was 100, it would have been way higher than when it was at 20. So it can start at any point, but it will be a horizontal straight line from them. And well, autonomous investment can even be 0 at all income levels. We're not interested in investing, bro. We're either consuming or saving. Not interested in investing. So that is also possible. Investment can also be 0 as a horizontal straight line, but it still is autonomous. Autonomous just means it does not fluctuate with income fluctuations. Now, savings. Savings starts in the negative y-axis below the x-axis. And it goes up and up and up, and then there's the break-even point. This break-even point is when S equals 0, or when all that's consumed is equal to all that is earned. That is the point when C equals 1. And now you might think, isn't C equal to Y the same as 80 equals AS? Yeah, that confusion can happen, but remember 80 includes C and I. So we're not counting investment expenditure if we're just going to consider consumption. So remember that the point where S equals 0 is where C equals Y. That's when consumption expenditure equals income. So then savings starts getting positive, and it intersects investment. And the point of intersection is the equilibrium. Now if we plot two graphs simultaneously, one of 80 AS and one of S and I, so when we plot the graphs and see the equilibriums, we'll see that the equilibrium points are exactly same. So we can conclude that AD equals AS and S equals I simultaneously. Now there are two different situations when it comes to S and I. What if S is greater than I and what if S is less than I? Obviously we've already studied if S is equal to I. But what if S is greater or what if S is less? Now if S is greater, that means that consumption is less, which means AD is less, which means there is some excess supply which is stored as unplanned inventory. So if S is more, that means unplanned inventory will rise. So what will happen is that since S is more, C is less, AD is less, which means supply is left over, which means unplanned inventory will rise. Now, what if S is less? Well, if S is less, then what will happen is that consumption, or C will rise, which means AD will rise, which means the supply will be in shortage, and so we'll have to draw from our planned inventory. So if we'll have to draw from our planned inventory, that means our planned inventory will fall. Now there are certain assumptions that we take when we're calculating equilibrium through the Keynesian theory. First of all, AS is perfectly elastic. That means any change in AD, there will be a proportionate change in AS. The second is that there's a two-sector closed economy. That means there's only the producers and the consumers. Then, now AS is perfectly elastic, and we're studying a two-sector closed economy. The last is that there's a short run. Okay, short run means we're measuring in a certain period of time where technology won't be changing, hence only employment can influence output. Now, you can influence the equilibrium by influencing investment. So what happens is that if you increase investment, AD will shift upward. Now, if AD shifts upward, what you'll see is the difference caused by investment, like the change in investment, it's way less in comparison to the change in income. So the change in investment in comparison to the change in income is very minuscule. Why is that so? That is because of the investment multiplier. Now, before we see that, first let's analyze it in a chart. Now, if there's x-axis and y-axis, what happens is that there's a 45-degree line, that is AS. And what happens is that there is AD, which gets raised a little bit. So now what will happen is that the equilibrium will shift from the left to the right. And that change, the change in output, the change in income, that amount, the change in income is actually a lot of times the change in investment. Why is that so? Well, that's because of the investment multiplier. Okay, so the investment multiplier is represented with a capital K. Many of you must have heard about the money multiplier. Now, the money multiplier is a tiny k, a small k, but the investment multiplier is a capital K, okay? So, investment multiplier calculation is pretty straightforward. It equals delta y upon delta I. That means change in income upon change in investment. Now, change in income upon change in investment, that's pretty straightforward. How many times the change in investment is a change in income? But what if we don't have the change in income and change in investment? What if we have only the marginal propensity to consume or the marginal propensity to save? Then can we calculate K? Well, yep, that's true. We can calculate K because K is also the reciprocal of MPS. That is 1 upon MPS, or 1 upon 1 minus MPC. 1 upon 1 minus MPC is 1 upon MPS, obviously, but how do we derive this formula of 1 upon 1 minus MPC? Now, we all know that delta y equals delta C plus delta I, right? Now, what happens is that we're studying that K equals delta y upon delta I. That means that's equal to delta y upon delta y minus delta C. And if we put an upon y below each of these, that means delta y upon delta y divided by delta y upon delta y minus delta C upon delta y. That means 1 upon 1 minus delta C upon delta Y. That is equal to 1 upon 1 minus NBC. That is 1 upon MPS, or the reciprocal of MPS. And hence we've gotten K, or the multiplier, the investment multiplier. Now what we'll see is that K is indirectly related to MPS and is directly related to MPC. Now if K is directly related to MPC, what does that mean? Now if it's indirectly related to MPS, that means greater the MPS, less the K. Because for example, if MPS is 0.2, then K is 1 upon 0.2 or 5. But if MPS increases to 0.8 or 0.5, for example, then K decreases to 2. So when MPS increase, K decrease, that means there's an indirect or inverse relationship. Now if we take the example of MPC, then for example, if MPC is 0.2, now 1 upon 1 minus 0.2 equals 1 upon 0.8, and that is equal to 1.25. Now that's 1.25. What if we increase the MPC to, for example, 0.9? Because then 1 upon 1 minus 0.9 equals 1 upon 0.1 equals 10. So when we increase MPC, K increased along with it. So there's a direct relationship. And that shows that there's a direct relationship between MPC and investment multiplier. But how is this proven? Well, you see, when there's investment, there is a certain income. Now, if you spend more on consumption expenditure, what will happen is that consumption expenditure somewhere, sometime, will get converted into someone's income. Okay? And once that gets converted into someone's income, he again spends a majority of portion, if the MPC is high, as consumption expenditure. And that consumption expenditure going will become someone's income again. And then that income will get converted into consumption expenditure, which will again convert it into income, which then again convert it into consumption expenditure. And this goes on and on and on till, it's zero. Now what happens is that the amount of saving that we've done, if that is minimal, that means our consumption is maximum. So the more amount of consumption we do, the more times the income will get multiplied. So the higher the MPC, the more will the income get multiplied. And this proves that if MPC has a direct relationship, then NPS should have a negative relationship or an inverse relationship, because then what will happen is that if there is more savings, that means there is less income creation, because then we'll spend less on consumption expenditure and less aggregate expenditure, which will cause less income, which will again cause less consumption expenditure and less aggregate expenditure. So MPC has a direct relationship with K, and MPS has an indirect relationship with K. Now today's last concept, forward action and backward action of the multiplier. Now what happens is that the change in investment can be both positive and negative. Now if there's negative, then there's a backward action of the investment multiplier. So that will cause many times decrease in income, change in income. And what will happen is that if it's positive, then it'll cause many times positive change in income. So what will happen is that if there is an increase in investment, then there is a forward action of the multiplier. Decrease in investment, then there will be a backward action of the multiplier. So this was all for today. Now we finally learned about short run equilibrium output. It was kind of an easy topic if you ask me. And this is MG signing off. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share. And this is Mini Money Mastermind saying goodbye.